The dust swirled around Sarah's worn boots as she stared at the parched fields. The Oklahoma sun beat down, unforgiving, mirroring the harshness of the times. The year was 1934, and the Depression had sunk its teeth deep into the heart of America. Sarah's family had lost everything: their farm, their hope, and, recently, her father to a bout of pneumonia that a doctor's visit could have prevented. Now, with her mother ailing and her younger siblings hungry, Sarah knew she had to do something drastic. She clutched the newspaper clipping in her hand, the ink smudged from countless readings. Wife wanted. Rancher seeks hard-working woman for marriage. Must be willing to relocate. Inquire Box 34, Harmony Gulch. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only option she could see. Love was a luxury she couldn't afford. Survival was the only thing that mattered. Her plan was simple, if not a little cold-hearted. She would answer the advertisement, present herself as a suitable wife, and marry this rancher. Once she secured her family's future, a roof over their heads, food on the table, she would find a way to leave, perhaps after a year or two. She wasn't sure how she would manage it, but she refused to be trapped in a loveless marriage forever. Sarah knew the risks. She was a city girl, through and through. She had never milked a cow or planted a seed. But she was a quick learner, and she was determined. She imagined the rancher, probably an older, lonely man, desperate for companionship. She would play the part of the dutiful wife, earn his trust, and then, when the time was right, she would disappear, leaving behind a note of apology and a promise to repay him someday. It was a cruel plan, she admitted, but necessity knew no morals. Her family needed her, and she would do whatever it took to save them, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness in the process. She just hoped she wouldn't regret it. Harmony Gulch was little more than a wide spot in the road, a scattering of weathered buildings clinging to the dusty earth. The general store, the saloon, and the blacksmith shop seemed to sag under the weight of the relentless sun. Sarah stepped off the bus, clutching her meager belongings, and felt a wave of apprehension wash over her. This was it. There was no turning back now. She asked the storekeeper for directions to Caleb Johnson's ranch. The man, a wizened fellow with squinting eyes, gave her a long, assessing look before pointing towards a dirt track that disappeared into the rolling hills. Caleb? He keeps to himself mostly. Gruff fella. Lost his family years back. Don't expect much conversation. Caleb Johnson's ranch was even more isolated than Sarah had imagined. The house, a sturdy but unpainted structure, stood alone against the vast expanse of the prairie. The barn was weathered and worn, and the fences sagged in places. There was an air of neglect about the place, as if time itself had forgotten it. Caleb himself was even more imposing than Sarah had pictured. He was a large man, with broad shoulders and calloused hands. His face was etched with deep lines, and his eyes, a piercing blue, held a sadness that seemed to penetrate right through her. He wore worn denim overalls and a faded flannel shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat shaded his face. He looked every bit the hardened rancher, weathered by years of toil and loss. He watched her approach, his expression unreadable. "You're Sarah, I reckon," he said, his voice rough and gravelly. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded, trying to project an air of confidence she didn't feel. "Yes, Mr. Johnson. Thank you for meeting me." Caleb grunted, turning and heading towards the house. "Come on, let's get you settled." He didn't offer to take her bag or any pleasantries. He just kept walking, his back a silent invitation to follow. Sarah swallowed her nervousness and hurried after him, wondering what she had gotten herself into. This man was nothing like she had imagined. He wasn't lonely or desperate. He was broken, and Sarah had a feeling that breaking through his hardened exterior would be harder than she ever anticipated. The inside of the house was as stark and unwelcoming as the outside. The main room served as a kitchen and living area, furnished with only the bare necessities: a rough-hewn table, a few chairs, and a wood-burning stove. A narrow staircase led to the upper floor, presumably where the bedrooms were located. The air was thick with the smell of dust and wood smoke. Caleb gestured toward the small room off the kitchen. "That'll be your room," he said curtly. "Supper's at 6. Don't expect any fancy cooking." Sarah nodded, her heart sinking. This wasn't the fresh start she had envisioned. This was a prison, albeit one with a roof over her head. She deposited her bag in the small room. It contained a narrow bed, a rickety dresser, and a single window overlooking the barren landscape. Later, at supper, the silence was almost deafening. Caleb ate his meal, a plate of beans and cornbread, with a grim determination, barely acknowledging Sarah's presence. She tried to make conversation, asking about the ranch, the weather, anything to break the tension, but he responded with monosyllabic grunts or curt answers. Why did you put an advertisement in the paper?" Sarah finally asked, unable to bear the silence any longer. Caleb stopped eating, his blue eyes fixing her with an intense gaze. "The ranch needs work. I need help." A wife seemed like the most practical solution. "Practical?" Sarah echoed, surprised by his bluntness. "Practical," Caleb repeated. "Don't expect any romance, Sarah. This is a business arrangement, nothing more." Sarah's resolve hardened. He made her plan even easier. She would help him, he would help her family, and then she would leave. No messy emotions, no broken hearts. It was a perfect arrangement, even if it felt a little empty inside. As she lay in bed that night, listening to the wind howling outside, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had made a terrible mistake. Caleb Johnson was a hard man, a closed-off man, and she couldn't imagine spending even a year of her life with him. But she had made a promise to her family, and she wouldn't break it, no matter how difficult it became. She would survive this, just like she had survived everything else. And one day, she would be free. The wedding was a simple affair, a formality performed by the town's weary-looking preacher in the dusty parlor of Caleb's house. There were no guests, no flowers, no music. Just Sarah, Caleb, and the preacher, their voices echoing in the otherwise silent house. Sarah wore a simple dress she had sewn herself, her hands trembling slightly as she recited her vows. Caleb's voice was flat and emotionless as he spoke his own. Afterward, Caleb shook the preacher's hand and gave him a few dollars. Then, without a word to Sarah, he turned and walked out of the house, heading towards the barn. Sarah watched him go, a wave of loneliness washing over her. She was married, but she felt more alone than ever. The first few weeks of their marriage were a blur of hard work and strained silence. Sarah tried her best to learn the ropes of ranch life, but she was clumsy and inexperienced. She milked the cows awkwardly, her hands aching from the unfamiliar movements. She struggled to feed the chickens, scattering the feed everywhere but in their trough. She even managed to set the kitchen on fire while trying to bake bread. Caleb watched her with a mixture of impatience and amusement. He rarely offered help or encouragement, but he didn't criticize her either. He simply observed, his blue eyes following her every move. One day, while Sarah was trying to mend a broken fence, Caleb finally spoke. "You're doing it wrong," he said, his voice gruff. He took the hammer from her hand and showed her the proper way to drive in the nails. His hands were strong and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. As he worked, Sarah watched him, noticing the way his brow furrowed in concentration, the way his muscles flexed beneath his worn shirt. For the first time, she saw a glimmer of something beneath his hardened exterior. He wasn't just a gruff rancher. He was a man who knew how to work, a man who took pride in his land. And maybe, just maybe, a man who was capable of more than just practicality. But Sarah quickly pushed the thought away. She couldn't afford to let herself feel anything for Caleb. Her plan depended on it. One sweltering afternoon, a neighboring farmer, old Mr. Peterson, arrived at the ranch, his face etched with worry. His prize bull, Bessie, had taken ill, and he didn't know what to do. He was too poor to afford a vet, and Bessie was his livelihood. Caleb listened to Mr. Peterson's tale with a stoic expression, offering no words of comfort. Sarah watched from the porch, expecting him to turn the old man away. After all, what did Caleb care about a sick bull? He barely cared about his own wife. But to Sarah's surprise, Caleb nodded slowly. "I'll take a look," he said gruffly. He grabbed his medical kit and followed Mr. Peterson back to his farm. Sarah watched them go, her curiosity piqued. She couldn't understand why Caleb would bother helping someone else, especially someone as poor as Mr. Peterson. Hours later, Caleb returned, his face covered in sweat and grime. He didn't say a word about Bessie, just went straight to the barn to tend his own chores. Sarah, unable to contain her curiosity, followed him. "How's Mr. Peterson's bull?" she asked tentatively. Caleb shrugged. "She'll be all right. Just needed some tending." You helped him," Sarah said, surprised. Caleb looked at her, his blue eyes piercing. "He needed help," he said simply. "What else was I supposed to do?" Sarah didn't know what to say. She had expected Caleb to be selfish and uncaring, focused only on his own needs. But he had gone out of his way to help a struggling neighbor, expecting nothing in return. Later that week, Sarah saw Caleb tending to a stray dog that had wandered onto the ranch, its leg caught in a barbed wire fence. He carefully cleaned the wound and splinted the leg, his touch surprisingly gentle. He then gave the dog food and water, letting it sleep in the barn until it was strong enough to leave. These small acts of kindness, hidden beneath Caleb's gruff exterior, began to chip away at Sarah's preconceived notions. She started to see him not just as a means to an end, but as a human being, a man with a heart, however well hidden it might be. And the more she saw, the more her carefully constructed plan began to crumble. One evening, as Sarah was clearing the supper table, she noticed a small, wooden box tucked away in a corner of the room. It was intricately carved, the wood worn smooth with age. Curiosity overcoming her, she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, were a few small objects: a tarnished silver locket, a child's worn shoe, and a faded photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile, holding two young children. Sarah recognized the woman in the photograph. It was the same woman in a small, framed picture that sat on Caleb's bedside table, the only personal item in his otherwise Spartan room. She had assumed it was his mother. Suddenly, Caleb entered the room, his face darkening as he saw Sarah holding the box. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Sarah quickly closed the box, her face flushed with guilt. I'm sorry," she stammered. "I didn't mean to pry. I was just curious." Caleb snatched the box from her hands, his knuckles white. "That's none of your concern," he said, his voice low and dangerous. He turned to leave, but Sarah couldn't let it go. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The woman, the children." Caleb stopped, his back rigid. He stood there for a long moment, his silence heavy with unspoken pain. Finally, he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "My wife and my daughters," he said, each word a painful admission. "They died years ago. Flu epidemic. Took them all in a week." Sarah gasped, her heart aching for the man standing before her. The pieces suddenly fell into place. His gruffness, his isolation, his inability to connect. It was all a shield, a way to protect himself from further pain. "I'm so sorry, Caleb," she said softly, reaching out to touch his arm. Caleb flinched at her touch, pulling away. "Don't," he said, his voice trembling. "Just don't." He clutched the box to his chest and hurried out of the room, leaving Sarah standing there, stunned by the weight of his grief. His tragic past, now revealed, cast his present actions in a completely new light. Her plan to leave him suddenly felt even more callous and impossible. A week later, a fierce thunderstorm swept through Harmony Gulch, unleashing torrential rain and howling winds. The ranch was battered by the storm, the house shaking under the force of the wind. Sarah huddled in her room, listening to the thunder rumble and the rain lash against the windows. Suddenly, she heard a crash from the barn. Fear gripped her, but she knew she had to do something. She grabbed her coat and braved the storm, battling her way to the barn. The barn door had been ripped from its hinges, and the wind and rain were tearing through the structure. She saw Caleb struggling to secure a loose beam, his face grim with determination. "Caleb, are you all right?" she shouted over the roar of the storm. He didn't answer, just continued to wrestle with the beam. Sarah rushed to his side, helping him to secure it. Together, they worked to reinforce the barn, their movements clumsy but determined. As they struggled against the storm, Sarah saw a flicker of fear in Caleb's eyes, a vulnerability she had never seen before. It was as if the storm had stripped away his hardened exterior, revealing the raw pain and grief that lay beneath. At one point, a particularly strong gust of wind threatened to tear the roof off the barn. Caleb grabbed Sarah, pulling her close to protect her from the flying debris. For a moment, they stood there, huddled together in the heart of the storm, their bodies pressed close. Sarah felt Caleb's body trembling, not just from the cold, but from something deeper. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with concern. "It's just a storm, Caleb," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the wind. "We'll get through it." Caleb looked back at her, his blue eyes filled with a mixture of fear and gratitude. For the first time, Sarah saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes, a flicker of something that resembled trust. The storm eventually subsided, leaving behind a trail of destruction. But as Sarah and Caleb surveyed the damage, they knew that they had weathered more than just a storm. They had weathered a moment of shared vulnerability, a moment that had forged a connection between them that neither of them could deny. And Sarah knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that her plan to leave Caleb had been washed away by the rain. In the days following the storm, Sarah found herself drawn to Caleb in a way she hadn't anticipated. She watched him as he repaired the barn, his movements still stiff and awkward, but his face less grim than before. She found herself wanting to ease his pain, to bring a little bit of light back into his life. But the thought of her plan still lingered, a shadow in the back of her mind. She had promised her family she would help them, and she couldn't just abandon them now, not when she was so close to securing their future. She wrestled with her conscience, torn between her duty to her family and her growing feelings for Caleb. She knew that if she stayed with him, she would be giving up her chance to provide for her mother and siblings. But if she left, she would be breaking his heart, a heart that had already suffered so much. One afternoon, Sarah found Caleb sitting by the graves of his wife and daughters, a place she had never seen him go before. He was simply sitting there, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped. He looked so lost and alone. Sarah approached him cautiously, her heart aching at the sight of his grief. She knelt beside him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Caleb," she said softly. He looked up at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "They should be here," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "They should be here, living their lives." Sarah squeezed his arm, offering him what little comfort she could. "I know," she said. "I know it's not fair." They sat there in silence for a long time, the only sound the gentle breeze rustling through the trees. As Sarah sat there, she realized that she couldn't leave Caleb. She couldn't abandon him to his grief. He needed her, and she needed him. Her family would understand, she told herself. They were strong and resilient, and they would find a way to survive, even without her. But Caleb, he couldn't survive without her. He needed someone to share his pain, someone to bring a little bit of joy back into his life. And Sarah knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she was that someone. Her internal conflict resolved, she knew she could never go through with her original plan. With her decision made, Sarah threw herself into ranch life with a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just going through the motions, fulfilling her part of a bargain. She was working alongside Caleb, building a life together. She started taking on more responsibilities, learning to drive the tractor, tend to the livestock, and even fix the machinery. She discovered a knack for gardening, planting rows of vegetables and flowers that transformed the barren landscape around the house into a vibrant oasis. Caleb, too, seemed to soften in her presence. He started offering her words of encouragement, praising her hard work and her quick learning. He even started smiling, a rare but welcome sight that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. One day, while they were working in the garden, Sarah had an idea. "We should sell some of our vegetables at the market in Harmony Gulch," she suggested. "We can make some extra money, and it would be a good way to connect with the community." Caleb hesitated, his brow furrowing. "I don't know, Sarah," he said. "I haven't been to town in years." "It will be good for you," Caleb Sarah insisted. "You need to get out and see people." Finally, Caleb agreed. The following Saturday, they loaded a wagon with their vegetables and drove into Harmony Gulch. Sarah set up a stall at the market, displaying their produce with pride. Caleb stood awkwardly by her side, his eyes darting around nervously. He seemed uncomfortable and out of place. But as people stopped by their stall, admiring their vegetables and chatting with Sarah, Caleb began to relax. He even started to smile and engage in conversation, sharing stories about the ranch and the challenges of farming. By the end of the day, they had sold almost all of their vegetables, and Caleb was beaming with pride. "We did good, Sarah," he said, his voice filled with genuine pleasure. "We did real good." As they drove back to the ranch that evening, Sarah knew that she had made the right decision. She had found a purpose in her life, a reason to stay. She had found love in the most unexpected of places, and she wouldn't trade it for anything in the world. And she was also helping Caleb find his way back to the world. Their newfound happiness, however, was soon threatened. A letter arrived, informing Caleb that the bank was threatening to foreclose on the ranch. The depression had hit everyone hard, and Caleb was behind on his payments. Caleb was devastated. He had worked his whole life to build this ranch, and the thought of losing it was unbearable. He retreated into his shell, becoming even more withdrawn and distant than before. Sarah refused to let him give up. She knew that they could find a way to save the ranch, but they had to work together. She spent hours poring over the ranch's finances, looking for ways to cut costs and increase revenue. She discovered that Caleb was paying too much for supplies, and she negotiated better deals with local merchants. She also came up with a plan to raise chickens for eggs, which they could sell at the market. Caleb initially resisted her ideas, but Sarah was persistent. She showed him the numbers, explaining how her plan could save them money and generate income. Finally, he agreed to give it a try. Together, they built a chicken coop and purchased a flock of hens. Sarah took charge of the chickens, feeding them, collecting their eggs, and selling them at the market. The egg business proved to be surprisingly successful, bringing in a steady stream of income. But it wasn't enough to save the ranch on its own. Sarah knew that they needed to find a way to generate a large sum of money quickly. She remembered that her mother had taught her how to sew, and she had always been good with her hands. She proposed to Caleb that she start sewing quilts and selling them at the market. Caleb was skeptical, but Sarah convinced him that it was worth a try. She spent weeks hunched over her sewing machine, piecing together colorful quilts from scraps of fabric. The quilts were beautiful, each one a unique work of art. Sarah displayed them at the market, and they quickly caught the attention of the shoppers. People were drawn to their vibrant colors and intricate designs. Within a few weeks, Sarah had sold enough quilts to pay off a significant portion of Caleb's debt. They were still a long way from saving the ranch, but they had made significant progress. Their work was far from over, but it was enough to keep hope alive. The threat of losing the ranch became a shared burden, strengthening their partnership even further. Just when things seemed to be looking up, a figure from Caleb's past arrived in Harmony Gulch, stirring up old wounds and threatening their fragile happiness. Her name was Martha, and she was Caleb's sister-in-law, the sister of his deceased wife. Martha had always blamed Caleb for her sister's death, claiming that he hadn't done enough to protect her and her children from the flu. She had stayed away for years, nursing her resentment and grief. But now, she had come to Harmony Gulch, claiming that she needed Caleb's help. She said that she was destitute and had nowhere else to go. Caleb was torn. He felt guilty for his sister-in-law's suffering, but he also knew that Martha's presence would bring nothing but pain and conflict into his life. Sarah, however, saw things differently. She believed that everyone deserved a second chance, and she urged Caleb to help Martha. "She's family, Caleb," she said. "We can't just turn her away." Reluctantly, Caleb agreed to let Martha stay at the ranch. But her presence quickly created tension in the household. Martha was critical of everything Sarah did, from her cooking to her gardening to her relationship with Caleb. She constantly reminded Caleb of his past, dwelling on the loss of his wife and daughters, and subtly blaming him for their deaths. Sarah tried to be patient with Martha, but her constant negativity was wearing her down. One evening, after a particularly heated argument, Martha confronted Caleb directly. "You don't belong with her, Caleb," she said, pointing at Sarah. "You belong with someone who understands your pain, someone who shares your memories." Sarah, overhearing the conversation, felt a pang of hurt. She knew that she could never truly replace Caleb's deceased wife, but she had hoped that she had earned his love and trust. Caleb looked at Martha, his eyes filled with sadness. "Martha," he said gently, "Sarah has brought me more happiness than I ever thought possible. She has helped me to heal, to move on with my life. I'm not going to let you take that away from me." He turned to Sarah, taking her hand in his. "I love you, Sarah," he said, his voice filled with emotion, more than words can say. It was the first time Caleb had ever uttered those words, and they filled Sarah's heart with joy. But the conflict with Martha was far from over, and Sarah knew that they would have to face it together, as a family. Their newfound love would be tested, but they were determined to protect it. Despite Caleb's declaration of love, Martha's presence continued to cast a shadow over the ranch. Sarah knew that they couldn't simply ignore her. They had to find a way to help her heal and move on with her life. Sarah decided to take a different approach. Instead of arguing with Martha, she started listening to her. She asked her about her sister, about her childhood, about her dreams and regrets. She learned that Martha had always felt overshadowed by her sister, that she had always longed for a family of her own, but had never found the right person. She realized that Martha's resentment towards Caleb stemmed from her own feelings of inadequacy and loss. Sarah shared her own story with Martha, telling her about her family's struggles during the Depression, about her plan to marry Caleb for survival, and about how she had fallen in love with him despite herself. Martha was surprised by Sarah's honesty. She had always seen her as an outsider, a threat to her sister's memory. But now, she saw her as a fellow human being, a woman who had overcome her own challenges and found happiness in the most unexpected of places. One day, Sarah suggested to Martha that she start helping with the quilting. Martha had always been skilled with her hands, and Sarah thought that it would be a good way for her to express her creativity and connect with the community. Martha hesitated at first, but eventually she agreed to give it a try. She quickly discovered that she enjoyed quilting, and she soon became an integral part of Sarah's business. As Martha worked alongside Sarah, she began to heal. She started to let go of her resentment and grief, and she started to see Caleb in a new light. She realized that he had suffered just as much as she had, and that he deserved to be happy. One evening, Martha approached Caleb and Sarah, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I was wrong. You two belong together. You've brought each other so much happiness." She then announced that she was leaving Harmony Gulch to start a new life for herself. She thanked Caleb and Sarah for their kindness, and, with Martha gone, a sense of peace settled over the ranch. Caleb and Sarah were closer than ever, their love tested and strengthened by the challenges they had faced. But Sarah still hadn't told her family about her decision to stay with Caleb. She knew that they were counting on her, and she didn't want to disappoint them. She wrote a letter to her mother, explaining everything that had happened. She told her about Caleb's kindness, about his tragic past, and about the love that had grown between them. She admitted that she had initially planned to leave him, but that she couldn't bear to do it. She knew that her mother would be worried about her future, but she hoped that she would understand. She hoped that she would see that Sarah had found happiness, a kind of happiness she never thought possible. Weeks passed, and Sarah waited anxiously for a reply. Finally, a letter arrived, her mother's familiar handwriting scrawled across the envelope. Sarah tore open the letter, her heart pounding in her chest. Her mother's words were simple but heartfelt. She wrote that she was proud of Sarah for finding love and happiness, that she understood her decision to stay with Caleb. She also wrote that her family was doing well, that they had found work and were managing to make ends meet. She assured Sarah that they would be okay, even without her financial support. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she read her mother's words. She felt a sense of relief and gratitude wash over her. She had made the right decision. She had chosen love over duty, and her family had understood. That evening, Sarah shared the letter with Caleb. He listened intently, his eyes filled with emotion. When she finished reading, he took her hand in his, squeezing it tightly. "Thank you, Sarah," he said softly. "Thank you for staying. You've given me a second chance at happiness." Sarah smiled, her heart overflowing with love. "We've given each other a second chance, Caleb," she said, "and I wouldn't trade it for anything in the world." She finally understood the meaning of true love. Their life was simple, but full of love. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. Years passed. The depression slowly eased, and life on the ranch became more prosperous. Caleb and Sarah worked side by side, their love deepening with each passing year. The ranch was no longer a symbol of loss and loneliness, but a testament to their resilience and their love for each other. One spring evening, as the sun began to set, painting the sky with vibrant colors, Caleb led Sarah to a small hill overlooking the ranch. He had built a small bench there, a place where they could sit and watch the sunset together. They sat in silence for a while, enjoying the beauty of the landscape. Finally, Caleb turned to Sarah, his blue eyes filled with love. "Sarah," he said softly, "I never thought I would find happiness again. After losing my family, I thought my heart was closed forever." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. He opened it, revealing a sparkling diamond ring. It was his wife's, the one he had given her so many years ago. "I know I can never replace her," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "But I want you to have this. It's a symbol of my love for you, a promise that I will always be there for you, no matter what." Sarah gasped, tears